I found Joe Mallory's letter the unglamorous way, wedged in the bottom of a battered cardboard box, still inside a yellowed envelope addressed to someone named Eleanor Parker, not me. The paper smelled faintly of smoke, and there was a tiny smear of chalk dust along one fold, like he'd packed a classroom into his kit by accident. One line had been underlined twice, and it wasn't about battles or medals. It was about a single square of chocolate and a boy who called him a devil. Then the letter stopped mid-thought. Page 2 was missing, and the last clear word on page 1 was a name, Karl. So I made a call, pulled a train schedule, and decided I wasn't leaving that gap alone. In January 1945, on the German border, Joe Mallory's platoon stopped at a village schoolhouse and began turning it into a hold. A U.S. infantry platoon had pushed through the forest after a scattering of retreating troops, then received the order that always sounded simple and never was: hold, watch, and be ready to move. Corporal Joe Mallory helped occupy the nearest structure, a village schoolhouse with broken windows and a yard churned into grey slush. He posted men at doors and corners, walked the corridor to learn where sound travelled and where it died, and marked the places where a man could trip and fire by instinct. The result was a position that could survive a sudden probe. The cost was tension. Every improvement demanded time and attention were the very things the platoon no longer had in reserve. The lieutenant wanted a clean perimeter. The terrain refused to offer one. Snowdrifts hid ditches, and the tree line began so close to the schoolyard that a man could stand among trunks and watch the building without stepping into moonlight. Joe took a short patrol around the yard, tapping fence posts and kicking at piles of debris because he had seen too many improvised traps in too many empty places. He found nothing wired, but he found how easy it would be to approach unseen. The result was a faster, rougher fortification. Firing angles marked, blind spots noted, sentries rotated with stricter timing. The cost was exposure. Every trip outside reminded Joe how small their hold really was, and how much of the night belonged to whoever chose to use it. Inside, the building was stripped the way buildings were in a country being peeled from the inside out. Desks were missing, likely burned for heat. A chalkboard held a smear of half-erased arithmetic, and a torn alphabet chart hung like a relic of vanished routine. Joe and 2 men moved C-ration cases, canteens, a radio battery, and the medic's box into a back storeroom because it was the only room with a door. They stacked tins by type and counted them twice. The result was a single cache that could be guarded and inventoried. The cost was a single point of failure. If someone reached that latch, they reached food, medicine, and the platoon's patience in one motion. Food was already a quiet argument. Their supply line stretched behind them over ice-glazed roads and bridges that might not exist tomorrow. Sergeant Halverson, older than most and made suspicious by too many close calls, treated the ration boxes like ammunition: count, recount, assume theft. Lieutenant Becker tried to keep the platoon's mood from curdling, but hunger and cold sharpened every comment into an accusation, and rumors about armed civilians and last-ditch militia made even a child's shadow feel like a threat. The result was a unit balanced on routine rather than comfort. The cost was fragility. One breach, one missing tin, could tip discipline into anger. Shortly after midnight, the breach announced itself as a metallic clink from the storeroom, then a soft thud as a carton shifted under weight. The hallway sentry froze and signaled. Joe moved with 2 men, rifles up, steps measured to keep the floorboards from advertising them. He pushed the storeroom door with his barrel and cut a flashlight beam across the room. The result was a clear sight line for a second. The cost was that the figure in the beam used that second to choose violence. It was not a man. It was a child, 10 or 12, hollow-cheeked under a cap too large, hands already wrapped around a ration tin as if it were oxygen. He did not run. He swung the tin like a club and snapped his teeth at Joe's glove when Joe caught his wrist. The men pinned him without firing, but the struggle knocked cans across the floor and echoed up the stairwell, the sound of metal on wood ringing like a bell in the dark. The result was a living prisoner instead of a body in the storeroom. The cost was noise, enough to make every soldier imagine eyes in the tree line, listening. They hauled him upstairs into a classroom where broken glass glittered in corners and cold air poured through the frames. The boy kicked, spat, and cursed in German, eyes wide with hate and fear, repeating one word Joe understood: Teufel, devil. Lieutenant Becker arrived, dragged from sleep, and made a fast decision because the front rarely allowed perfect ones. Keep the boy contained until daylight and find a way to hand him off. The result was a temporary solution that prevented immediate harm. The cost was manpower. Someone had to guard the classroom, and the platoon did not have men to spare. At dawn, the medic checked the boy's hands and ribs and confirmed what Joe had felt in the struggle: malnourished, chilled, still strong enough to hurt someone if panic took him. While the medic worked, Halverson knelt and pried at the boy's boots. He found a damp fold of paper tucked under the insole. Crude marks, a line, a cross, and a set of numbers that might have been a time. The result was suspicion given shape, something a man could hold up and call evidence. The cost was ambiguity. The marks could mean meat or home or nothing at all, and men could fill nothing with whatever they already feared. A second search found a photograph sewn into the coat lining. It showed the boy beside an older young man in a German uniform, posed stiffly, neither smiling. On the back, in neat handwriting, Karl und Ernst, Weihnachten, 1943. When Joe touched it, the boy lunged for it with a panic too raw to fake, fingers clawing as if the photograph were his last possession. The result was a detail that dragged the boy out of the category of enemy and into something messier: family. The cost was complication. If the boy was being used, the photograph suggested the leverage had already been applied somewhere outside these walls. The platoon argued in low voices, the way men argued when their lives depended on unity. Halverson said children carried messages, pointed out roads, led ambushes into place, and that the paper proved someone had planned this. Another soldier muttered that the boy looked like his brother back home, and asked what any of them would do if that brother was starving. When Halverson suggested tying the boy's wrists until he remembers how to talk, Joe stepped between them and refused, not loudly but firmly enough to force a choice. The result was the first open fracture in the platoon's mood: fear on one side, restraint on the other. The cost was resentment. Halverson did not forget being checked in front of his men. Joe tried to communicate with gestures and a few German words, offering water and a ration tin. Karl refused until hunger won. Then he ate fast, eyes never leaving hands, weapons, and the door, as if every swallow might be punished. The result was proof of desperation and propaganda at once. He needed food, and he still believed the men feeding him were devils. The cost was discomfort. Watching a child devour military rations made the platoon feel cornered by pity and by fear, because pity could create negligence and fear could create cruelty. Becker decided Karl would remain upstairs, untied but guarded, until an orderly handoff became possible. He assigned Joe the long watch because Joe had kept his temper and because Becker needed someone who could prevent the classroom from becoming a punishment cell. As Joe carried a blanket up the stairs, Becker said, almost to himself, that they were guarding more than a road now. The result was a theme Joe could not shrug off. What they did to one child would say something about what the war had done to them. The cost was responsibility. Joe's rest and his standing with Halverson were now collateral. If you want to see what this turns into, the pressure outside the fence, the split inside the platoon, and the one mistake that almost makes the decision for them: hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. It's a small ask, but it keeps these quieter war stories from vanishing under the snow. Joe treated the watch like controlled routine because routine was the only tool he had that could reduce panic without requiring threats. Water at the same time, food placed in the same spot, distance maintained so Karl could choose to approach or not. Joe patched the worst gaps in the window frames with scrap wood, hammering softly, because cold made men stupid, and he could not afford more stupidity in that classroom. The result was a space that felt less like a cage and more like a guarded shelter. The cost was time, minutes stolen from sleep, and patience the rest of the platoon considered waste. Joe also used the classroom itself as a tool. He found a stub of chalk and wrote simple words on the board, Wasser, Brot, then added their English equivalents underneath, speaking each one once and pointing. Karl refused to play along, but his eyes tracked the letters the way a student's eyes tracked a lesson despite himself. The result was a thin, non-verbal channel that did not require Karl to surrender pride. The cost was exposure. Joe could feel his old life leaking through his uniform, and he knew men were watching him for signs that he had gone soft. Karl watched everything, even chewing. He tracked footsteps, weapons, and the angle of Joe's shoulders. Halverson read the boy's vigilance as calculation and kept pushing for harsher handling, bind the wrists, demand answers, break the silence before it broke them. Becker held him off, but the pressure moved sideways. It turned into barbed comments about Joe playing teacher and jokes about how a child could get them killed faster than a rifleman. The result was a new internal threat, the platoon's unity fraying under competing instincts. The cost was that Joe had to manage men as much as he managed Karl, and he could not do it openly without sounding like a lecture. Halverson decided to force the issue. He came upstairs with the boot paper in his fist and asked questions in sharp, broken German, stabbing at the numbers with a finger. Karl's shoulders rose toward his ears. When Halverson stepped closer, Karl swung a fist and missed, then tried to lunge for the door. Joe caught him and turned him back with a controlled grip before Halverson could strike. The result was a near-violent interrogation, aborted into a struggle that proved Karl's panic was real. The cost was escalation. Halverson left with his face hard, and Joe knew the sergeant would now frame restraint as disobedience rather than judgment. A radio message from a neighboring unit turned suspicion into something concrete. Reports of runners using civilian faces, small groups probing positions, and armed youths acting as scouts. Halverson repeated the warning like a verdict and stood in the classroom doorway long enough for Karl to see him. The result was a mood shift. Patience began to look like weakness, and weakness at the front invited bad luck. The cost was that Karl, sensing the change, retreated deeper into silence as if speech itself would become a trigger. After the radio warning, Joe heard a new sound upstairs in the dark. Karl whispering to himself, counting in German under his breath, then stopping, then starting again. Once Karl pressed his forehead to the window board as if listening for a reply. The result was a chilling impression that Karl was rehearsing a report he did not want to deliver. The cost was sleeplessness. Joe found himself watching the tree line through cracks in the boards and feeling his own mind turn every shadow into a plan. That night, Joe saw fresh tracks in the schoolyard snow. Adult prints, heavier than Karl's, skirting the fence line before fading into the dark. A sentry reported a brief wink of light in the tree line. Joe brought both reports to Becker, and Becker doubled the watches and tightened the perimeter. The result was a safer outline on paper. The cost was sharper exhaustion in men who now had even less sleep, and exhaustion made rifles jumpy and judgments lazy. By the following night, someone tested them again. A stone clacked against a window board, not hard enough to break it, hard enough to announce presence. Men snapped awake, boots scraping, rifles sliding off shoulders into hands. The hallway filled with whispered orders and the dry click of safeties being checked. Joe stayed upstairs, because if he left, Karl might bolt in the confusion or be mistaken for an attacker in the stairwell. The result was a sudden tightening of the platoon's nerves, a confirmation that the schoolhouse was being watched. The cost was that tension climbed another rung, and the margin for error shrank again. In the grey morning after the stone, Becca sent a two-man sweep around the yard while Joe watched from the upstairs window. The men found no attacker, but they found a thin cord half buried in snow near the fence, tied to a broken branch, positioned like a crude alarm line. They cut it and carried it back as proof. The result was evidence that someone outside was paying attention and trying to measure their reactions. The cost was escalation. Halverson took the cord as confirmation that Karl was part of an organized effort, and he began to speak about the boy as if he were already convicted. Joe brought the cord and the boy's reactions to Becca again, and this time Becca did not argue about morality. He talked about risk as if it were a ledger. What increases the chance of contact? What decreases it? What keeps the platoon moving? Then, quietly, he added that discipline was not only for firing lines, it was for moments like this, when exhaustion made men eager to punish the nearest target. The result was a clear signal that Joe would not be left alone in the coming decision. The cost was that Becca tied his own authority to the outcome, and if the choice went wrong, it would be his failure on paper and in memory. Karl's behavior shifted with each external sign. When Joe entered with water, Karl's eyes flicked toward the window as if listening for a cue. When distant shouting rose and fell outside, Karl flinched as if he recognized voices. Joe did not interrogate. He waited, letting routine do its slow work, but the silence felt like a countdown. The result was a pattern Joe could not ignore. Karl reacted to the outside world, not only to the Americans. The cost was uncertainty. Joe could not tell whether Karl was a willing runner, a coerced one, or simply terrified of what waited beyond the walls. On the third day, Joe woke with a cough that scraped his throat raw. He tried to hide it, but Karl noticed. After a long stillness, Karl pushed his own half-full cup across the floor toward Joe. The gesture looked reluctant, like a concession made against his will. Joe's first instinct was to refuse, because refusing kept the lines simple and simplicity kept men calm. He took the cup anyway and drank, because rejecting it would close the only crack he had managed to create. The result was a small bridge built without words. The cost was risk. Accepting kindness from a prisoner made Joe's position harder to defend in front of men who equated empathy with weakness. Joe set the cup back where Karl could reach it and placed the photograph on the floor between them. He pointed to the older brother's face, then to Karl, then made a separating motion with his hands. Karl's jaw tightened. He looked away, then spoke quickly in German, too fast for Joe to catch fully. Joe heard names, Ernst, Mutter, and the word Wald, forest. When Karl finished, his eyes darted to the window and his hands clenched as if he expected immediate consequence. The result was information entering the room for the first time, however partial. The cost was fear. Karl's body said he was not only afraid of the Americans. Joe brought out the damp paper from the boot and pointed to the numbers. He held up fingers in a counting gesture, then pointed toward the door and down the road. Karl shook his head violently, then, angry at himself, pointed toward the forest and said one word Joe recognized from radio warnings. Nachricht. Message. He mimed walking, stopping, and then chopping the air, marking time. The result was an ugly, simple meaning Joe could translate. Someone expected Karl to report how many Americans were in the schoolhouse and when they might move. The cost was inevitability. Whether Karl wanted to or not, someone had assigned him a role in a plan. Joe stopped before he turned the moment into an interrogation. Instead, he tested what he could without touching Karl. He stood, paced to the door, and spoke in English about a false movement time, then watched Karl's eyes flick toward the window as if the words had weight outside. Joe repeated the false time once, softer, and Karl's shoulders tightened again as if the sound alone created obligation. The result was confirmation built from reaction rather than confession. The cost was guilt. Joe felt like he was using a starving child as a censor, even if he did it to prevent blood. He went to Becker with observable facts. The word message, the focus on numbers and time, Karl's reactions when movement was mentioned, the tracks, the stone, and the cord by the fence. Halverson was present and dismissed it as manipulation, insisting the boy was steering them into a trap. Becker listened, then looked past them as if drawing a diagram in his head. The result was a shift from moral debate to tactical urgency. The cost was that Karl became both human and hazard in the same breath, and the platoon had to carry both truths at once. That afternoon, the movement order arrived. Advance in 48 hours, align with adjacent units, no delays. Becker repeated it, then stared at the upstairs door as if the order had been addressed to the child as much as to the platoon. The result was a hard boundary around their options. The cost was that orderly solutions evaporated. No time for paperwork, no time to wait for transport, no time to pretend the war cared about procedure. Becker tried anyway. Radio contact toward the rear was unreliable. A runner asked a passing truck column about prisoner pickup and returned with nothing but a shrug and a curse about roads. Becker tried to raise a military police post on the net and received only static and clipped voices redirecting him elsewhere. The result was confirmation of frontline chaos. The cost was time the order had not granted, and time was now the most expensive thing they owned. Halverson pushed harder. He argued that keeping Karl alive in the building invited whoever waited in the woods to act, and that releasing him would feed them information. He wanted Karl bound, isolated, and handled at the last second like a parcel thrown off a moving truck. Joe pushed back with consequences instead of principles. Binding a terrified child in a room full of jumpy rifles increased the chance of an accident. Abandoning him invited his death. Carrying him invited delay and exposure. The result was a stalemate that grew sharper as the clock ran down. The cost was division. Every hour spent arguing was an hour not spent resting, preparing, or watching the tree line. Catastrophe almost arrived that night. As men packed gear and checked straps, Karl grew restless upstairs. He paced, stopped to listen, then paced again, as if the walls were shrinking. Joe stayed close because he could feel the building's nerves tightening. In the hallway below, a sentry, exhausted, keyed up, heard movement near the stairwell and raised his rifle. Karl stepped toward the door at the wrong moment. Joe moved on instinct, putting himself between barrel and chest. A shot cracked. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Joe's shoulder. The result was a near killing triggered by fear, not enemy fire. The cost was proof. No argument about policy mattered as much as the fact that their own discipline could break and kill a child. Joe kept his voice level when he addressed the sentry. He did not rage because rage would justify more rage. He said, "No more shots unless you see steel," and Becker backed it with a stare that ended discussion. The result was control restored through discipline. The cost was that discipline did not repair the fear in Karl's face, and it did not erase the platoon's knowledge that their own errors were now as dangerous as anything in the woods. After the near shot, Joe sat with Karl in thin pre-dawn light and understood what had changed. Dragging this decision forward would kill someone, and the most likely someone was a child. He looked at the chalkboard's smeared numbers and thought of the arithmetic he used to teach, how a wrong carry could ruin an entire column. The result was clarity without comfort. They needed a decision that reduced the worst outcomes, not a decision that pretended to be clean. The cost was acceptance. Joe would choose a path that still left guilt behind because there was no path left without it. Joe went to Becker with a plan shaped like a wedge. Release Karl before dawn, not empty-handed and not on the original schedule. Give him food enough for days, something warm, and a direction toward a town where aid might exist. Places where relief organizations and local administrations sometimes gathered as the front shifted. Then change the platoon's departure time and route so any information Karl carried would be less useful. The result was a plan that treated Karl as human and hazard at once. The cost was pride. Admitting a starving child had influenced their tactical choices, and pride was already thin in a platoon running on cold. Becker did not accept the plan as sentiment. He accepted it as a way to reduce risk, and he added a hard condition. The platoon would keep the new movement time quiet, and they would leave decoy signs behind. Joe watched as Becker ordered a small detail to stomp a set of heavy tracks away from the road at a false hour, then circle back under cover of trees. The result was a simple deception meant to break the value of any message leaving the schoolhouse. The cost was effort, extra labor in freezing dark from men who already had too little strength, and secrecy that could breed more suspicion inside the unit. Halverson fought the plan anyway. He called it supplying the enemy and surrendering to manipulation. Joe answered with consequences instead of ideals. Karl had almost been shot inside their own building. Binding him invited a second accident. Abandoning him invited his death. Releasing him without direction sent him straight back to whoever owned his fear. Changing the schedule was not mercy. It was survival. Becker listened and then made the command decision that ended argument. The plan would be executed. The result was authority applied to a problem authority could not truly solve. The cost was resentment. Halverson's compliance would be cold, and Becker knew it. Before dawn, Joe returned upstairs with a small bundle. He had a scarf pulled from abandoned clothing, a ration tin, crackers, a canteen half filled, and a piece of chocolate he had kept for a day when he needed leverage. He tore a corner from a larger map and spread it on the classroom floor. He pointed to the schoolhouse, then traced a route away from the forest toward a town marked in thin print, tapping the road intersections as if they were steps. He circled the town and mimed walking and resting, then shook his head toward the tree line. The result was a crude translation of safety into motion. The cost was honesty. Joe could not promise Karl safety. He could only offer odds. Before he rolled the bundle closed, Joe broke the chocolate into 2 uneven pieces and placed one on the floor between them. Karl stared at it as if it might be a trick, then took it with fingers that hesitated on the wrapper. He ate slowly, not wolfing it the way he had wolfed the first rations, and for a moment his face looked like a child's face instead of a fighter's. The result was a final wordless proof that Karl understood kindness when it was offered without conditions. The cost was attachment. Joe felt the knot tighten in his chest, because giving away his last comfort made Karl's survival feel like a debt Joe had begun to owe. Karl studied the lines, and then clutched the photograph as if it were the only thing that could not be taken. He did not cry. He looked older than his years because war had taught him that tears were expensive. Joe held out the scarf. Karl hesitated, then took it with fingers that trembled from cold or pride. The result was acceptance of help without surrender of defiance. The cost was finality. The exchange made it real that this was not a temporary holding, but a goodbye. They walked Karl down the stairs and through the corridor, past sleeping shapes under blankets, past the storeroom door where it had begun. Outside, snow creaked under boots, loud in the quiet. Becker stood by the doorway with his command face on. Halverson watched from shadow, arms crossed. Joe placed the bundle into Karl's hands and stepped back. The result was irreversibility. Karl was no longer under their control. The cost was helplessness. Joe could not escort him, could not guarantee what waited beyond the first bend. Karl took 2 steps, then stopped and turned back. For a second, the feral edge returned, as if hatred would be easier than debt. Then it broke. In rough English, he forced out 2 words and a name he had likely practiced in secret. "Thank you, Joe." The result was a confirmation that landed harder, because it was small and real, a fracture in propaganda sealed by a child's mouth. The cost was weight. Those words turned Karl's unknown future into something Joe would carry, not as a story to tell, but as a question that would not close. Karl ran, small legs cutting a line through snow toward the road. His footprints formed a fragile chain into darkness. The platoon moved on the altered schedule and took the new lane through the forest, spacing out and scanning as if the trees had mouths. Nothing fired on them that morning. The result was movement without immediate blood. The cost was uncertainty. Silence proved nothing, and Joe would never know whether they had avoided a trap or feared a ghost. Hours later, jolting in the back of a truck, Joe looked back once toward where the village had been. He imagined the schoolhouse empty again, and the snow outside marked by two kinds of lines, wide vehicle ruts, and somewhere beyond sight, the small prints of a boy carrying food, a scarf, and an old photograph. The result was a change that no report would record. The enemy was no longer an abstract category in Joe's mind, but a child who had called him devil and then learned to say thank you. The cost was permanence. Joe would never know what happened to Karl, and the not knowing would follow him long after the war found an ending.